All right, we are live.
All right. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. My name's Mike Skelton. I'm the CEO of the Greater Manchester Chamber, and want to thank you for tuning in to our webinar today in partnership with Mainstay Technologies on preparing and supporting your remote workforce. This is one of many virtual programs the Chamber is going to be working on over the next several weeks. We're kicking off a number of these this week and into next week. We actually have our first virtual happy hour later today in partnership with the Manchester Young Professionals and Ancient Fire and Mead and Cidery, which we're excited about. Because we know that in this situation, people still have a desire to connect, to learn, to get educated. And we thought this remote workforce topic is an important one that many members are interested in. And there's a lot we can learn from partners like Mainstay. So one housekeeping note is, and we'll be sure to share this, is that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted later so that you can rewatch. You can also share with colleagues and your team members. And we're going to build up a library of these great tools that will be useful for our chamber members. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Robinson, the Chief Service Officer of Mainstay Technologies. He's going to walk us through a presentation on this important topic, and then we're going to have time for some Q&A afterwards. So Ryan, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate it. Thanks to you, and thanks to Corinne and the Chamber, who really understood the need for this consulting and acted very fast to make it happen. I really appreciate that. As Mike mentioned, I'm the Chief Service Officer at Mainstay, and what we are is we're a managed IT services provider and an information security services provider. But we've done a lot of thinking about not only the technology, but also the cultural element of being in a fully remote workforce. We've been a highly remote workforce ourselves for many years, and have worked with a lot of companies to help move them in that direction. So we think a lot about company culture and not just on the technology side. So just again, a couple housekeeping items, as Mike said. Given the webinar format here, what I'm going to do is walk through some notes with you, but I don't want you to feel stressed about taking notes, because even if you don't want to go and watch the video again, you can just email our communications manager, Corey Hoyt. You can see his email address up on the screen there, choyt@mstech.com, and he can send you the full detailed notes on this. Also, as you're thinking of questions as we go, feel free to type in the questions as we go. Don't feel like you got to wait to the end until we have Q&A. Your questions might have nuances that you might forget later on, so really encourage everyone to type them as they roll. I also mentioned too, by the way, that as you can imagine, there's a lot of folks concerned about these things, and so we've been doing a lot of education around them, and my voice is starting to get a little sore over the course of these last couple weeks. So if you hear me coughing, it does not mean that I have the coronavirus. It usually just comes when I'm talking. So I just have that voice, that tickle in the back of my throat. So my apologies in advance if I'm coughing at you. Thankfully, you can't catch any viruses over the internet anyway, so that's good. At least not these kind of viruses. So let's dive in. And what my goal is here is to share with you kind of a playbook, is a way of thinking of it, for how you can move your team into a fully remote workforce. And if you've already done that, how you can really make sure that that team is working well together, that they have the right tools, that they're doing that in a secure way, and that you're thinking about the company culture appropriately and guiding and shaping that as we go. So let's talk about the situation that we find ourselves in. I mean, the coronavirus has changed the market dramatically in just a matter of days. I mean, you think about where we were only 3 weeks ago, and organizations are having to go partially or fully remote almost overnight. I mean, quite literally, that was the case in New Hampshire, where a couple weeks ago on a Sunday, we found out that schools were closing down, and individuals were having to figure out how they were going to work from home the very next day. And so the stay-at-home order that was put into effect yesterday has just taken that a further step, now requiring non-essential businesses to shut down. And of course, that's frustrating for many people, considering that all businesses are essential for the people that are working in those businesses and those who are serviced by them. So we're in a challenging situation. The good news is that the market has been step by step moving towards enabling a remote workforce for years. Think about the proliferation of mobile devices and cloud hosted infrastructure and applications, increased internet bandwidth. I mean, where would we all be if this happened in 1980, right? But we have, excuse me, we are in a situation where we're going to have to adapt very fast. When the meteor hits, it's like you either go extinct, you adapt slowly, which means you're probably going to still go extinct, or you adapt fast. And small businesses, medium-sized business, large businesses, we're all going to have to adapt very fast in order to change or to adapt to this new changing world. Mike and I were talking before we jumped on too, and it's like this isn't just a change that is affecting us now. It's going to be a temporary thing that's going to last 2 weeks. The business environment is forever changed from this. There are going to be technology changes. There are going to be workflow changes in your organizations. There are going to be impacts financially and in the economy. And so this requirement to adapt fast is not going to just benefit you in the next 2 weeks or 2 months, but really for the years to come. So let's talk about the playbook and what the playbook for enabling a remote workforce looks like. First of all, you have to start with proper technology. The tools that we utilize, from cloud-hosted infrastructure to remote-ready endpoints to proper peripheral devices that you can have at your home office, excuse me, all of these things are necessary in order to ensure that you've got a team that can work remotely and effectively. Also, you have to have the proper security layers and workflows. It's not just about having secure technology either. It's not just about having the right firewall or the right secure technology controls, but it's also having the right workflows and user training and all the elements of developing organizational security. And then cultural intentionality. It's not just culture develops regardless of whether you want it to. It's the question of whether you're going to be intentional about it and move your organization to having still a great culture, even despite the fact that you're going to have the geographical limitations and the lack of human connection that you're going to have when you are in the office every day with your team. So let's talk about proper technology first. First, whenever we think about technology or the technology infrastructure, we have to think about servers. Servers are basically just big computers, right? The servers are just computers that have a different operating system that provide either hosting for applications, hosting for individual forms of data, or they provide individual services to the computers that you utilize. So you have 3 options really when you want to move to a fully remote workforce in terms of your servers. The first is you can move to cloud-hosted infrastructure, just sometimes called infrastructure as a service, which basically means you lift and shift the server environment that you currently have, and you take it from your local physical boxes, those local physical machines that you have in your server closet, and you move them into data centers, and you rent space basically instead of rent space in those data centers rather than buying the hardware yourself. And so you have both the option of a private cloud options there, like Rackspace, where you can essentially rent out individual servers in privately owned server farms or data centers, or you can move to the public cloud, which is what we typically recommend because there's cost savings in that. There's a level of control that you get in that. And so the 3 primary players are Microsoft's Azure platform, Amazon Web Services, and the Google Cloud. All of them are solid options, but if you're in the Microsoft ecosphere already, then Microsoft Azure can be a great option. Where this is not a great option for someone is, let's say that in your business, you just bought a new server house last year or this year, and now you've already invested. So in that situation, you're going to want to go with the third option that we'll talk about in a second, which is simply having your local servers, maintaining that investment, but then accessing them in a secure remote way. But option 2, and this middle column here is not an option that should be ignored by businesses, especially small businesses, which is going to serverless environments. If you move serverless, sometimes people don't think that they can do that. They just, they've had a server in their server closet for decades, or they just assume that that's a necessary part of having a business environment. But the reality is that there are now cloud-hosted both applications, file hosting options, and all the other additional services that you would get from your local server environment. You can now get from additional, other cloud hosted options. So for instance, let's say you utilize QuickBooks. Well, instead of having that QuickBooks application living locally on your server or on an individual desktop, now you can move that to QuickBooks Online. I mean, granted, QuickBooks Online is not the same thing, and there are functionality differences there, but there are some people who like QuickBooks Online even better. But if it enables you to be fully remote, then there can be a value there, even if there's a challenge, even if there's some workflow things that you need to adjust. If you're a nonprofit and you use like the Blackbaud software package, you can move to their NXT platform, which is their hosted platform. And for file sharing, you don't just have to rely on the file server that's on your server, but you can utilize something like Microsoft's OneDrive application, Dropbox for Business, ShareFile. These are all cloud-hosted options that are very, very easy to use and make it so that wherever you are, you don't have to log in with a VPN into your server environment. As long as you have internet access, you can access all of your files. And then even on the individual services, let's say something like account management, which is something that your local server would do for you. There's a service called Azure AD that Microsoft runs, which will manage all of your account access controls and so on. And down the line, there are ways to move to a fully serverless environment. That's a great option for businesses who, let's say, your server is already 5 years old anyway, you're going to be looking to replace that local environment. Consider a serverless option. It's really well worth discussing with your IT partner whether that's a valid option for you. And then the third option, and this is probably going to be the one that's most likely for most people joining us today, which is maintaining your local server, but just making sure that you have secure remote access. So using secure VPN, which stands for Virtual Private Network, which essentially puts you into the office, you could say, in a virtual manner. It's an encrypted channel that makes it so that you can access those resources that are on the physical server located at your office, but you can access them from home very securely. You can also use remote desktop services, which will allow you to remote into a computer, let's say at the office. You can work on your laptop at home and then remote into your computer at the office. And then that computer will access the resources from the server. There's LogMeIn, which is a very common remote desktop tool. ConnectWise is a company that has another tool called Screen Connect. Those are valid options. What I would say though, and this is important, is if you're utilizing VPN already or remote desktop services already, make sure that you are needing to fill in a secondary form of authentication beyond just a single password in order to access those resources. So in other words, let's say you open up your VPN client currently and you just put in your domain password in order to access the server and the data there. If you are not having to enter a secondary form of authentication, let's say a code that is sent to you via a text message, or you're not having to click on an application on your smartphone in order to ensure that, it means that you only have a single form of authentication, and that's not enough when you're talking about accessing your most sensitive data. You really want to have that secondary form of authentication. I'll talk about all that means a little bit later in more detail, but if you do not have that, you should really work with your IT provider and say, hey, can we get two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication implemented here on our server environment? Forgive me, I assume that a swig of water is probably better than a cough. So, all right, so that's for your servers. Let's talk now about the endpoints or the computers that you use. I mean, in a word, the goal here is you want to move from desktop computers to laptops, and you want to ensure that they're business class machines. Ideally not, when you're going down to Staples or Best Buy, but you want to ensure that they're business class machines that have all the appropriate ports, have solid chassis, that there's not adware or bloatware on those machines, which is often what you get when you get a retail machine down at Staples. Now, moving to laptops is nice to say, but there's an irony in me recommending that at this point, which is the fact that supply chains are very weak right now and the demand is very high, and that's not a good combination. So you may say, yeah, we'd love to go to laptops and be able to enable our team in that way, but it's just not possible. Well, desperate times call for desperate measures. So there are 3 other options that you have in the case that you can't maintain or attain a laptop right now. One is you can utilize your home or your desktop machine that you have at work currently, and you just bring it home. Now, the key in that, though, is you need to remember that those desktop machines may not have wireless cards built into them. In fact, most desktop machines do not. And so you'll need to probably get an Ethernet cable that you can utilize to plug into your router at home. And you need to realize that, you may set up your home office upstairs and your router is down in the basement. So you may need a, kind of an interim solution of a 50, 75, 100-foot Ethernet cable to do that. So don't assume that you can just go grab your desktop at work and then plug it into the wall and then you're good to go. You may need to have a long Ethernet cable to set you up. And then as external wireless cards become more available, they're very hard to find right now for obvious reasons, then you can get that as a more long-term solution. Second option you have is going to get a non-business class machine from a retail store. The thing is, you want to make sure you work with IT to ensure that you have the appropriate specifications on it, that you have the appropriate ports that you need, and especially you make sure that you have the right video card. That's something that people often don't think of when they go and buy a computer, but the applications that you utilize, especially if you're using anything high-end, if you're using CAD software or things like that, you may need to have a special video card, and the software won't render and sometimes won't even open if you don't have appropriate video cards for that. So make sure you've got that in place. And then you should also check the return policy, because a lot of these stores are being a lot more careful with their return policies these days. And you don't want to get home, find out that your machine doesn't work for your needs and not be able to take it back. And then the last option, which is really not a good option, it's the least ideal of these options, is using a home computer. If you have to use a home computer for whatever reason, just make sure that it's managed and monitored by IT. So it should have IT's monitoring software, should have central antivirus on it, should have probably a web and URL filtering tool. Don't just assume you can kind of pick up your home laptop and start working. There's a lot of sensitive data, and you don't know if you've got keyloggers installed on that machine or other kind of malware that would put your clients or the data from your business at risk. And you also should not let your family members utilize that home machine while you're using it for work purposes. All right, monitors and peripheral devices. So I'm just mentioning real quick here that Stay Work Play, an organization that we love, has an awesome thing right now where they have hashtag Stay Home Work and Play. So you can go on LinkedIn or Twitter and see that hashtag. And people are submitting their pictures of their home setups. And as people have been doing that, we've been noticing that so many folks still have their home setup just looks like their laptop sitting physically on a kitchen table or something like that. So what I would really want to encourage all of you to do is, one, get dual or triple monitors. Microsoft did a study not long ago that said that if you had a dual monitor, it could increase your efficiency between 10 and 49%. And that's a crazy number. And that, of course, is a big swing between 10 and 49%. And that swing is really based on how many applications you utilize at any given time in the day, how long that employee is on their computer in a given day. But, most of us now, especially considering this new environment, it's probably going to be a very high number. So it's well worth getting that secondary or tertiary monitor. But in addition to that, get an external keyboard and mouse. I mean, so many people will type on their laptops and then they end up, accidentally hitting the trackpad with their thumb or with their hand, which throws the mouse off, and you lose a lot of efficiency when you're only using your laptop trackpad or keyboard. So really encourage you to get some sort of solid wireless or external keyboard and mouse as well. And then you should also get a docking station. If you look on your screen there, you'll see that at the bottom right hand of that computer screen, there's a little black box. That's what a docking station, excuse me, a modern day docking station looks like. It's like shape, the shape and size is basically like an external hard drive. But what it does, it has multiple ports on it. So, let's say you have a newer laptop that doesn't have a ton of USB ports or doesn't have appropriate cables or ports for you to plug in your screen cables into. What a docking station will do is it'll extend all of that. So it'll give you additional USB ports, additional display ports, and so on. And some of the newer ones also will allow you to have a single cable that comes from that docking station that will also give you power to your laptop as well. So literally you can sit down, plug one cable into your laptop, and it gives you full power. It gives you all of the peripheral devices, printers, copiers, scanners, you name them. They cost typically like $150 and really well worth the investment. All right, let's talk about some communication tools. I want to go over 3 in particular with you. I want to talk about Microsoft Teams, Zoom, which we're using, excuse me, we're using for today's webinar, and the G Suite, particularly Google Hangouts. There's a good chance that a bunch of you who are joining us today are joining really to learn more about these video conferencing tools. So let's start with talking about Teams. So first of all, I want to say something that is really unique about Teams, Microsoft Teams, as opposed to the other 2 that we're going to discuss. And also, I also should mention that there are a ton of different video conferencing tools out there. I mean, there's Adobe Connect and Join.me and Cisco WebEx. All of them have their own pros and cons and most ideal use cases. We think that these 3 tend to be the most ideal depending on the circumstance you're in. So I want to talk through each 3 and the kind of pros and cons and use cases for each. So the first thing that I'll mention is that Teams is in a bit of a class of its own. And the reason is because it can function as a full, what's called a unified communications platform. So unified communications basically means you have a single platform where all of your communication, from instant messaging to screen sharing to video sharing and conferencing, phone conferencing, and actually even your phone system can all be on a single integrated system. And that is really where Microsoft Teams shines. Teams can not only do things that Zoom and Google Hangouts can do, like video sharing and instant messaging and so on, but it can also be your phone system. So if you've got a VoIP system right now or a digital phone system at your office, and now and now everyone is home and not really being able to utilize that, Teams can become your full phone system. So clients, anyone from the prospects, anyone from the outside can call in, and then you can answer phones via the Teams application. So that's a really big distinguishing factor for Teams that the other 2 do not have. So if we're just talking about the conference calling side of that, though, the benefit, so I'll give you some pros and cons for Teams. For Teams, the pros are, if you're in the Microsoft ecosphere already, it's fantastic. There's all kinds of integration. So for instance, to give an example, let's say that you want to, you open up Outlook and you want to create a meeting. Well, with one click of your mouse, you can turn that calendar invite into a Teams meeting, and it will automatically populate a conference ID number to be able to send in that calendar invite, as well as a link that people can just literally click the link and then be right there present and on that video chat or that phone chat. And even if they don't have a Microsoft themselves, or they don't have a Teams license, they can still externally, so you can still invite prospective clients or clients who may not have the same solution as you. They can still join via web browser or what have you, and still be engaged in that regardless of their licensing package. There's also lots of collaboration options. Again, I mentioned, you can do full screen sharing. You can have it as your phone system. But there's also really just some great collaboration that it can have, or integration with other applications too. So let's say, for instance, you're an organization where you use Salesforce or SurveyMonkey or MailChimp. You can integrate Teams into all of those things and populate results from your SurveyMonkey campaign or whatever into Teams and see it there. You can also create individual, what Teams calls channels. And those channels can be utilized for different departments within your organization. So let's say you have a finance team and an operations team and a sales team and so on. You can have a different channel within each, for each of those teams, where those individual teams can have an ongoing chat. They can share ideas through that. It's an incredible collaboration tool. So it's not just company-wide, but you can slice it in individual internal teams. You can also invite a lot of people using Teams. So 250 max typically for audio and video conferencing. But even if you wanted to have a massive, you wanted to do a webinar or have a massive live broadcast, you can go up to 10,000 people for live events. So there's not a lot of limitations that Teams is going to create. The cons for Teams are really just that there's cost, and in a way, that's also a pro. And I could have even mentioned above that if you're in the Microsoft ecosphere, you probably are already paying for Teams licensing. You may not be using it, or you may not be using it to its full, but you may already be paying for the licensing. So you really want to work with IT to make sure you understand what you have available to you. And so when I say cons, the cons are that there's costs, is really that there's additional costs that you would pay, let's say, for if you wanted to turn Teams into your phone system. But even those cons are really not cons per se, because you're already paying a phone vendor to supply those. And so it typically is less expensive, in fact, to utilize a unified communications platform like Teams for a phone system. The only increased cost that you're going to have would be that if you go to Teams, you're going to have to utilize one of these guys, a headset, instead of like your physical phones, and you're going to if you want really high quality headsets, then there's costs associated with that. But again, when you think about it, you have to typically pay for handsets, those sort of old-fashioned handsets. It's not like those are free either. So the cons are that there's additional licensing costs, but again, you're most likely going to still pay less than the other services that Teams would be providing if you're paying a different vendor for them. All right, so let's talk about Zoom. So Zoom is what we're using for today's webinar, and there's a lot of pros with Zoom. First of all, Zoom is very easy to set up an individual account for or a corporate account for. In fact, for those of you who may have bought stock in Zoom back in January or before, you're probably a very happy person right now. And their stock has been rising like crazy. And that's partly because of its flexibility. So even if, whether you're in the Microsoft ecosphere or the Google ecosphere, it doesn't matter. You can set up Teams and stand it up and get going really quickly. They've been an industry leader for a long time and have just a quality product. Their overall performance tends to be very good. There's fewer hang-ups and technical glitches oftentimes in Zoom. Part of the reason is they have very good bandwidth throttling technology, so that the application understands how much bandwidth is flowing to and from your system, and will automatically calibrate how many pixels are being shown and received and that kind of thing, which creates a much smoother flow. Now, I say that, and Murphy's Law, I mean that in like 2 minutes, we have some sort of technical glitch, but Zoom tends to be very reliable. It's also better built for webinars, just the interface and how it functions. Part of the reason we're using it today. And with that said, Teams is getting much better at that all the time. And even here at Mainstay, I think we'll probably end up moving to Teams for our webinar platform. But they've been creating a great platform for webinars for a long time. Now, the cons for Zoom is that it's not natively integrated with Microsoft products, and the business world tends to run on Microsoft, and so you don't have those same integration options. Same thing for Google, you don't have the same integration there, and also Teams can't replace your phone system, so it can't be that full unified communications platform. All right, so let's talk about the third one, Google, the G Suite, and specifically Google Hangouts. So Google Hangouts are great. What the pros are for Google Hangouts are that if you are similar to the Microsoft structure, it's like if you're in the Google ecosphere, then it can be a great solution for you. And there's lots of integration points. Just like if you're in the Microsoft ecosphere, you're going to want to tend towards Teams. Google tends to do a great job with education. So if you're in a school system or in a business that's just integrated in that way, Google Hangouts can be fantastic. It's also free for schools. And Google just does a great job with having very user-friendly, intuitive formats. So even things within Google are named well, so like Google Hangouts, for instance, they have 2 different structures. They break down into Hangouts Meet and Hangouts Chat. And Hangouts Meet is really for conference calling and video conferencing. Excuse me, you can create a meeting and send a link to that through Hangouts Meet. But then Hangout Chat is just one-on-one. And so, even just like the naming conventions sound like what they actually provide. And Google's just been a leader at that for many, many years. And you're never going to get more user-friendly than Google. If you are a sole proprietor, for instance, and you're just running your business out of your Gmail web client, for instance, I mean, Google Hangouts can be the perfect solution for you. Con, if you're not in the Google ecosystem, it tends to be the least integratable. For instance, Zoom has much better integration, for instance, with Microsoft than Google does, because Google's sworn enemies, and also it can't replace your phone system. So there's pros and cons to each, and pros and cons to each of the other different video chat solutions out there. But those are hopefully some helpful high level ones. All right, let's talk about layer 2 here. Security layers and workflows. I mean, basically, we're in a very unique situation right now where organizations are having to move remote. They're trying to change very rapidly, and they can often become really fast and loose with security. Also, our users, who are already our number one security risk, are in a situation where they may be more likely to fall for social engineering tricks when they're in a new environment, navigating change. And home networks typically don't have the same security layers, technical security layers, as business networks do. So you put all those together, and then you combine that with the fact that the hackers aren't taking a day off. They're paying close attention to this, and cybersecurity threats and breaches are at an all-time high, because this is a great opportunity to be able to to compromise individuals and organizations. So I want to give you some key security tips and all this. The first is multi-factor authentication. I referenced it before, but basically it means that in order to access data or applications or key information, you need to not just have a single factor, which is something like a password that could be guessed, or you could be tricked into giving up, or it could be cracked with a free password cracking tool. But you need to have a secondary form of authentication that ensures that there's something that someone would have to have physically in order to access that. So they not only have to have something but they would have to, let's say, have stolen your smartphone as well, or chopped off your thumb to use your thumbprint, or plucked out your eye. Sorry, this is getting gruesome. To use a retinal scan. Therefore, your security dramatically increases when there's that secondary form of authentication that's required. Now, the keys are where do you put that two-factor authentication? You don't want to put it everywhere, because that could be really cumbersome. But I would recommend a few places. One is your bank accounts, whether they be business or personal. And if your bank doesn't offer a multi-factor authentication option, you should really consider getting a new bank, frankly, because that may be indicative of other security challenges that they have on their end, and ways in which they may not be protecting you. And it shows just a lack of security sophistication on the part of that bank. Email is another one. Email should be covered with that. Now, sometimes people object and say, well, I don't want to, I open email all day long. I don't want to have to go back and forth and enter secondary code every time. But modern authentication allows you to simply cache that secondary code or secondary factor of authentication on an individual device. So you don't have to go back and forth and put that in all the time. It's very convenient and easy. And then, of course, on remote access tools like VPN or remote desktop that I was mentioning before. You also want to make sure that you have really good staff training. I mean, your users are your number one risk, even when they were in the office. Now, how much more when they're outside of it? So training should be a part of every time you bring on a new staff member. They should have to have security awareness training. And those should be repeated every year with updated information about latest threats, latest phishing scams, and so on. The key thing that you want to train excuse me, your users on is really secure email practices. Remind them that this is a time where they need to be most diligent with email, and that 91% of 91% of security breaches start at least with email. And so, you remind your team that, one, they don't want to click on any links or attachments that they don't need to. And the number one link that you never want to click in an email, it's the unsubscribe link, which is counterintuitive, but the unsubscribe link is going to be the one that's most likely to have some sort of malware behind it, because it's the one that's most likely to be clicked. Instead, you want to set your spam filter and mark that as spam, so that you can be sure that you're teaching your spam filter what to look out for. Remind your team not to click that download images button, not unless they know that that's from a safe sender, because that download images button in Outlook, for instance, will enable macros, it's called, on that, and will basically, if there's anything that was corrupt, or if there's anything malicious in that email, it will then allow them to access it directly. And then lastly, encourage your team to voice verify anytime they're suspicious about something. So if they get a call, if they get an email, anything that they think is maybe not from the person purported it to be from, they need to voice verify that. So back in the day, if you got an email from your boss and you thought, I'm not sure that this is actually them and that they're asking, I'm not sure that this information I should give up to them. You could open up a new email, put their email address in and say, hey, I got this email, said it was from you. Is it actually from you? Problem is now their account may be compromised. And so that you're just going to get an email back that says, yes, that was for me. So what you need to do now is you have to actually call them and say, hey, was that actually you? So voice verify is a key in this. You also want to establish an information security program. And what I mean by that is that you should not just have technical security layers, but you should really be thinking about your organizational workflows related to security now more than ever. And don't assume that that's something that IT can do for you. That's not within the purview of IT. IT is about having appropriate technical controls. Having an information security program means you have the right policies and procedures. If you have compliances that you're under, let's say you're under HIPAA or PCI compliance there, or you're a manufacturing company and you're in the Department of Defense supply chain, you have your own compliance requirements, and you really need someone working with you to help guide and direct on how, as an organization, you meet those requirements and stay secure and mitigate risk. And that is even more the case now, where all of our businesses, right, are changing our workflow. So this is an appropriate and really ideal time to ensure that we have the right structure in place. All right, so now let's talk about culture. So this is our third layer here, cultural intentionality. Culture is not going to not be developed in your organization just because people are working remote. Culture is just going to change shape, and if you're not intentional about it, you may find that the company culture that's developed is not the one you want. At Mainstay, we've been very fortunate. We have an incredible team. We were named the best companies to work on the best companies to work for list last 2 years in a row. So we've thought a lot about culture. I mean, and to be clear, I'm not bragging about that. That's so much of that's just because we have an incredible team of people. But you have to be thinking wisely and well about your culture, because it will continue to develop whether you want it to or not. So some recommendations around this. So first are to check in with your team and hold them accountable, not just for their work product, but their work process. So for instance, like, encourage your team to have dedicated separate workspaces and not be sitting on their couch or their living room with their laptop. That's not good for their health or their back or their psychology. It's not just children that do well with having dedicated spaces. And again, that stay work play thing has made me realize how many people still really do kind of just set their laptop up on a kitchen table while the kids are running around. And we really want to encourage our teams to have the right process, not just the right end products of their work. Also, encourage your team to have daily routines, where they have a clear starting and end time. And we need to model this kind of idea of having appropriate work to home shifts. It's very easy when you go to work, right, and you go to the office and then you come back, there's a lot of clarity around, okay, work starts here and then work ends here. And we lose that when we're working from home. And so organizations that move to partially or fully remote need to be more intentional about that. And sometimes that even means as a boss, let's say if you're a business leader, let's say you jump on the laptop at 8 p.m. to email your team about something, and you just have to do that. You can't wait till the next day for whatever reason. Use the delay delivery button in Outlook. That will make it so that email you want to send out to your team at 8 p.m. will actually go out to them at 8 a.m. the next morning. Because you can easily create a culture where that work to home shift that already is going to be tougher in this new environment is completely blended if they're getting emails at all times of the day and night. Lastly on this, encourage you to increase your one-on-one and all team engagement. And basic communication is going to be more critical, and the way that we communicate and the frequency with which we communicate is going to be all the more important now that we don't have some of those natural connection points. So, turn your quarterly staff meeting into a monthly staff meeting and have it over video conferencing, but make it shorter maybe, or you turn your weekly rhythm meetings, or let's say your monthly rhythm meetings with individual team members on your team, turn them into weekly ones that are just shorter. And also default to video. It's easy I know for me personally, I never want to put people on the spot and ask them to do a video call. I was tend to just say, hey, you want to jump on the phone, because I know it puts less pressure on people. But in this environment, we all need to be seeing each other's faces, right? And we need that human connectivity. And so start to create a culture in your organization where people just assume that meetings are going to be video meetings, and that when you call them, you're going to be calling them over video chat instead of over the phone. There's also a great tool called Yammer, which Microsoft has. It's sort of like a Facebook for business, you could say, and allows your team to have a little more casual conversation, but connect in a human way, kind of replicating the water cooler, you could say, that you end up losing when you go fully remote. So how can Mainstay potentially help your organization in this? Well, we are a managed IT services provider, so we can either be your IT department or we can supplement your IT department. So if you have internal IT staff members who just need support in all this, we can also supplement them. And I'll just say on the IT side, when times are good, it's very easy to kind of put up with a lot of things, both from your employees and from your vendors and from your partners. But we are at such a critical moment right now where jobs are at stake, our businesses are at stake in all of this. And depending on the business you're in, maybe even lives are at stake. And we just cannot be okay anymore with ineffectual IT. If you're not getting what you need from your IT department, this is an opportunity to say, hey, look, this is serious now, and we really need to make a shift to either get some additional resources and get some support for our team. We need to enable our remote workforce. We need to stay secure. We need all of, it's like through this whole crazy mess, the needs of technology are increasing, not decreasing. And so this is not a time for ineffectual IT, but you really want to work with the right partner, especially at times like this. We can also provide training or consulting on any of the things that we talked about today and go deeper on them. We are also an information security provider, so we can help not just on the technical side of security, but on the organizational side. So we can provide risk assessments, compliance governance, user security training, policy development, workflow consulting, all of that. We can also do individual, either IT or security audits or assessments, and of course, a call anytime. So I hope that was helpful. And again, just a reminder that if you're interested in getting more detailed notes on this, you can just email Corey at choit@mstech.com. And so now I think we should transfer over here to do some questions and Q&A. I had trouble saying questions and answers. Q&A.
Great.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Ryan. That was great. Really great overview. A lot of good information. Really timely. So as we dive in, we have time for Q&A, and want to encourage people that in the taskbar at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A window that you can submit questions. I'll be keeping an eye on. I have a few questions to get us going, and also have gotten a few submitted as well. One, Ryan, I'll just get to right away.
Sure.
One of our participants asked, they have a fairly new personal laptop, and just to clarify, the docking station that you mentioned, you can buy those and they're compatible with generally any new laptop. Do you have any brands that you recommend, or certain ones that if someone's going out there to shop for one, they should look for?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the main thing that you want to look for is make sure that the whichever is the cord connecting from the docking station to your laptop, that you have the appropriate port for that cord. So in other words, let's say that you have a bunch of USB-C ports, which are the more common ports that most people are familiar with, or excuse me, a USB port. That's the most common one. But let's say the docking station that you want to buy is actually for a USB-C port. Well, that's going to be a real problem if you don't have a USB-C port on your laptop, right? So just make sure that you understand, and it will say right there on the box or on the specs, if you're buying it online, it'll say what it's compatible for and what the laptop port requirements are for it. But ultimately, yes, you can any laptop can utilize a docking station, and they have docking stations for every kind of ports out there. In terms of brands, we tend to be big fans of Dell's docking stations, because Dell is a primary manufacturer for individual laptops. they have, and they're the one with the lion's share of the market as well. So if you have a Dell laptop, first of all, that's going to be helpful. But even if you have an HP or other kinds, Dell just is a very high volume, high quality builder of those docking stations. So not that you can't ever find something that is more high end, but Dell
Sure.
tends to be pretty solid, affordable option, and high quality.
Great. Another one for something that you touched on. I thought the overview of the different video conferencing platforms was super helpful as we're all trying to explore and experiment with them right now. I'm noticing a lot of businesses and organizations are not only using these to connect as teams, but they're looking to do what we're doing today and produce their own webinar content. And I'm curious, do you have one that you didn't mention that I'm seeing used a lot as Crowdcast that
Yeah.
people are using, and it looks like that's geared more towards just putting out informational webinars like this. Do you have experience with that? What would your recommendation be on that one?
So I've not personally used Crowdcast. I know of other organizations that have and have had good success with it. I would say that as a general rule of thumb, what you find is that you either have applications like that running in one of two categories. Either they do one thing and then they do that one thing really well,
Right.
or you have the unified communications platforms that I had mentioned before
Yeah.
that just have enough R&D, research and development put in them that they can do a bunch of things pretty well. And so if you are in an organization, so Teams is a great example of that, right? Where Teams can do a ton of things. It can do basically anything you want, and it can do all of them pretty well because it's got the beef of Microsoft behind it. And so they have tons of research and development going into it. But even with Teams, it's like there are certain things that it's just not going to do as well as a particular solution that's designed for one particular thing. So, I mean, like I said, we're using Zoom today, right?
Yeah.
Big fan of Teams, but we're using Zoom because from a webinar perspective, they tend to be at the top of the heap. Crowdcast, same thing. They do one thing and they do that one thing really, really well. And so if you're an organization, the decision making paradigm is, do we need a bunch of things or do we need one thing? And if we only need the one thing, then let's go with the solution that does that one thing and does it extremely well. And so if that's the kind of thing you want to do is produce a lot of content, put it out to a lot of people, then a solution like Crowdcast or Zoom are really great options.
Great. We have time to get to a few more questions. So if anyone has any of them, please submit through the Q&A button. I have a couple more that we can touch on. Ryan, maybe you could just share, your experience in the last couple of weeks assisting clients of different sizes who've had to quickly transition to a remote workforce. We were talking about before that there's a lot of companies that of various sizes who have integrated this as part of their workflow over the past couple of years. But a lot of organizations just in the last 2 weeks are now responding quickly.
Yeah.
So how have you guys been helping them? What are the common pitfalls that you're seeing with the businesses that are trying to stand up this capability like overnight, basically?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, I think that we're seeing, I'd say the pitfalls fall into certainly the three categories we talked about today, right? Like they don't have the right tools and the right technology, or they don't have the right security mentality, where they're not focused on security through this. Or they just don't have the right intentionality around their cultural development and thinking about that. So all of those things need more intentionality. But I'll also say one of the other challenges that we've seen is just there still is a feeling, and none of us, I think Mike, you and I talked about this a little bit before we even started the webinar, that there's still a feeling that many people have that says, hey, in 2 weeks from now, or now with the governor's May 4th deadline, we'll be able to get to that point and then we'll be able to kind of push the play button again. And we've been in kind of a pause and now we're going to push the play button and things will go back. And I think because of that, a lot of organizations are adapting very slowly, if they're adapting at all, but they're just saying, okay, well, we're just going to kind of put a parentheses here, and then hopefully we'll be able to start the sentence again in a couple weeks or in another month. And I think that's one of the big things that we're recommending to our clients is that they realize that there are long-term consequences for all this. And so, the best thing to do is to think about this as something that you're reshaping your organization towards,
Right.
and recognizing that especially with the move to remote work, that's most likely going to be a long-term shift, even if it's
Right.
not 100% later on.
Right.
Maybe it was 0% and now it's 100%. Well, it's probably not going to go back to 0. It's probably going to go back to 50 or 60 or 80.
Right.
And when you think that way, then you tend to make better decisions, be more consistent with your investments. You tend to be more intentional about all three of the categories that we talked about today.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think we're all hoping that May 4th is that target date where
For
we
sure.
can relaunch, but we just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So for all of our organizations and businesses, we're going to be so much better off for the next 6 months, years ahead to start to incorporate this now.
Yeah.
And because I think you're exactly right that this situation is going to kind of accelerate a lot of shifts that have been slowly happening on their own.
Yes, I think that's a great way of putting it. In fact, like that we're accelerating shifts that, oftentimes for organizations, they may have had in their minds that they wanted to do anyway,
Right.
but it was going to
Right.
be a couple of years. I mean, I think of something like, for instance, the paperless office. It's been a dream of many organizations for years to be fully paperless. Well,
Right.
now you start sending people home and they don't have their network multi-factor printers. And now
Right.
that change has to accelerate very, very quickly. And you can either
Yeah.
fight that and say, all right, everyone's going to bring home a local printer to their desk, or you can say, all right, this is actually our opportunity to do the things that we wanted to do anyway, and now accelerate those and just have them happen quickly, because now we can get the cultural buy-in from our team too.
Right.
You may have
Right.
had the person in your company who just loved to print emails, or
Yeah.
whatever, and you could just never make those shifts. And now this gives us all an opportunity to make really good changes in our business, not just
Right.
necessary changes for this circumstance, but good changes in our business. And it gives us a real a way that we can accelerate them and get them done and have people be on board.
Absolutely. So maybe to wrap up, I think I thought the culture piece was just so important and something we're all kind of learning on the fly in this environment. And maybe just sharing for you personally
Mm.
at Mainstay, what are some of the best techniques or tips that you've found that have really helped to solidify that culture piece to work well? And I'm sure it's different for every organization. You kind of have to customize your approach. But what are the
Mhm.
ones that have really kind of worked well for you?
Couple thoughts on this. I mean, first of all, I think that if we can rally our teams at this moment, and create and ensure that this is not just something that's sort of like a dark thing that we talk to our teams about, and kind of speak in a way where we're like, depressed and bummed, and my goodness, we've got this these waves crashing against us, and how are we going to make it? But instead really turn that around into an opportunity. And we talked about that a minute ago in terms of an opportunity to make changes in our business that we wanted to make. But even beyond that, an opportunity to come together as a team and be working in the trenches. I mean, I know that, for instance, in our team, uh, I help oversee kind of the whole company, but then I also have a dedicated team that I work with. And just a month ago, we were all saying, man, we wish we saw each other more often. We wish we worked together more closely
Right.
and had the opportunity to do that. But, we're on the road working with clients and all this stuff. And I'll tell you, in the last 3 weeks, we have been down in the trenches together, working so closely, having um, uh, huddles, video conference huddles almost every day to say, okay, here's this change that's coming. Here's how we're going to handle it. Here's a client need that's developing. How are we going to pivot our business to do so? And it's been, I mean, I don't want to say it's been fun in the sense that, in a way that's insulting to the seriousness of what's happening, but it has been a fun few weeks in certain respects.
Yeah.
It's been a time where we've all been able to bond together. One of our clients is over in Londonderry, MAS Medical Staffing, a medical staffing company. And I was talking just this morning with their CEO, Ken Johnson, and he was telling me how in his business he's gone through. This will be the third major financial
Mhm.
challenge that he went through the 2001 period and the 2008 period, and now this. And he says that in the middle of these times, it's always painful. It's always tough. But he said in every other instance, he and his team have looked back on it with a kind of fondness because of how much they've had to come together, be more efficient, be more effective,
Yeah.
and come together as people. And he shared with me a story of his son, who was in the Marines, and he said that when his son will always speak about being in Paris Island and in his training and all of that, and he speaks about it with such fondness. But he said if you look back at the letters he wrote us as parents while he was there, he was miserable. He was not having a good time. There was a lot of pain, a lot of challenge, but now he looks back on it with a deep fondness. And I think if we can take that approach with our teams and treat this as an opportunity to come together, to be more effective and efficient, then we can get our teams rallied around and create a really positive company culture in this moment.
I think that's such great advice, and the exact type of attitude we all need to have in this environment. So, well, I want to thank you and the team at Mainstay for partnering with us on this. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and sticking with us. It was a great program. I'm certain that we're going to get a lot of great feedback and members continuing to dive into this. And we look forward to partnering with you guys again soon on future topics. Thanks, Ryan.
I appreciate that, Mike. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Have a great weekend, everybody. Rest,
Yep.
relax, stay healthy.
Everyone stay safe and healthy out there. That's right.
All right.